I want to welcome everyone today to our program, which features Nick Nesbitt in conversation with Keisha, Allan, and John Drabinski. And this is about Professor Nesbitt's new book, The Price of Slavery, Capitalism and Revolution in the Caribbean, just out with University of Virginia Press. This virtual event is sponsored by the Center for Literary Comparative Studies, the Latin American and Caribbean Studies Center, and the John B. Slaughter Endowment Lecture Series in the Department of African American Studies, all here at the University of Maryland. Today's conversation is part of a series that we've housed at the center called Antiracism, Communities and Collaborations, which features scholarship, teaching, and public engagement to reimagine boundaries, model anti-racist, literary, rhetorical, historical inquiry, and to foster collaborative relations across and beyond campus. We're delighted to partner with our colleagues on campus today. And I want to thank in particular Professor Drabinski for bringing yet another program. We had a great conversation in the fall that we co-sponsored. And I want to thank, as always, my colleague in the center, the Director of Research Initiatives, Dr. Karen Nelson, and the GAs, Danielle Griffin and Shannon Neal. With this programming, we commit to art as a liberatory mode and a crucible of reckoning, the importance of community and communal histories, decentering whiteness, dismantling white supremacy, and refusing racism. And throughout, holding up and honoring the knowledge work of Black, Indigenous, and other minoritized scholars and artists. We do this situated as we are on a university campus built through wealth extracted by the slavocrats from the labor of enslaved Black women, men, and children. And we also do this on the ancestral lands of the Piscataway people, to whom or for whom I offer this brief land acknowledgement. We are on Indigenous land that was stolen from the Piscataway people by European colonists. We pay respects to Piscataway elders and ancestors. And we all ask that now, and through all of our work, our teaching, our research, our community service, we consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us all here today. And with that, I want to welcome my colleague, Professor Drabinski, to say a few words and turn the program over to him. Thank you.
Thank you, Tita. I wanted to start off with a few thanks to everyone at the Center for Literary and Comparative Studies, Karen and Tita, for hosting us in your series and on this platform. I really appreciate that. I love doing it in the fall. Everything goes so smoothly, which really said something about both the knowledge and professionalism and graciousness of the center. I really am grateful for that always. And to the Latin American and Caribbean Studies Center, I'm so happy that we're able to have this during Caribbean Week, which has had some amazing programming. And I feel like it's a real privilege to have this book talk in the middle of the week. So thank you to Isabella Alcanis for making that possible. Also wanted to say thank you to my home department, Department of African American Studies, my chair, Sangeetha Madhavan, Sharon Hodgson, Alyssa Conway, Situ Uono, for putting everything together in terms of money and publicity and all of that. These things often go really smoothly, as I assume this one will, which just means that people put in a lot of effort behind the scenes. So thank you to everyone. It's really actually a privilege and honor to introduce Nick Nesbitt, one of my favorite intellectuals. We share a lot of similar areas, and I'm always struck by the profundity of his work. Nick teaches in the Department of French and Italian at Princeton University, though he's coming to us today from Prague. He has edited 3 books, a book on Gilles Deleuze and music, a book on revolution and 1968, focused on Prague Spring, and also what to me is one of the more important editorial works people have done in the last 15, 20 years, which is for Verso put together a collection of writings by Toussaint and the Haitian Revolution, enormously important source. And even just that editing work, I think says something about Nick's range as an intellectual. He's single authored 4 books, Voicing Memory, Caribbean Critique, Universal Emancipation, and the book we're talking about today, The Price of Slavery. So I'm really happy that you're here, Nick. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I appreciate you making the time. I'll turn it over to Keisha.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. It's my pleasure to be here today to discuss Dr. Nesbitt's book, which I really enjoyed reading. So could you tell us a bit about the inspiration for this project? What questions motivated your writing? And what gap in scholarship and or understanding of slavery do you think this book fills? And what new horizons do you think it opens up?
Thank you, Keisha and John. It's just, let me say, it's really a pleasure to be here discussing with you and Tita and Karen as well at the center. Thank you so much for the invitation. This book is something that came out of the COVID years that we've just gone through and are still going through. And in that moment of lockdown, I, like everybody else, spent a lot of time online. And one of the places I was spending time was in a Facebook group on Marxist theory of value. And there are a lot of really smart people there who talk about different ways and aspects of reading Marxist Capital. And at some point in there, I got in a sort of argument with a group of them about the nature of slavery and capitalism and the place of slavery within capitalism. And they kept telling me that because slaves work, as they obviously do, and create and have created and profitable commodities like sugar and cotton, that therefore they created surplus value and contributed in that way to the growth and consolidation of capitalism. And I kept saying to them that doesn't fit within Marx's analytical framework of what capitalism is and how it functions, because he distinguishes at a very crucial level between surplus value, what he calls surplus value, and profit. And within his analysis, that distinction makes sense. And within it, slave labor doesn't create surplus value by definition. And I kept saying this to them, and they'd come back to me with the opposite, and nobody was changing anybody's mind. And so I got really motivated and worked up about this, because I think it's an important question. What's the nature of the relation between capitalism and slavery? Not just a historical question, but a general question that's of real contemporary relevance, not only because slavery continues to be a real and existing phenomenon across the globe in different forms, but also because of all the recent events that we know about Black Lives Matter and all of the permutations and developments of racism and racial capitalism, all these kinds of discourses. And I think that my conviction in this position that I wanted to stake out was a theoretical one, that in order to understand the ways that these various phenomena of racism and racial capitalism and these things that are very much discussed in many fascinating ways today, in order to understand these phenomena adequately, I think it's crucial to understand at the most basic level how slavery functions within capitalism. And my reading of Marx and capitalism has convinced me that it's really Marx's theory that gives us alone the means to understand that relationship as a social phenomenon. So not just in terms of the numbers of how much cotton, how much sugar, how much profit, how much this and that, but not just quantitative, but qualitative. What is the nature of that relationship, not as a lived experience of violence and domination and struggle, nor as a sort of historical phenomenon that we can observe in the archives, but what is it as a theoretical relationship? slavery, and capitalism. And that's a question that we receive as scholars, as people interested in this problem, from Eric Williams' famous book of that title, Capitalism and Slavery, from 1945. That book really, for me, defined a domain of inquiry that for Williams and the scholars who've looked at the question since him has been largely addressed as a historiographic phenomenon. And I wanted to step back and look at it in theoretical terms so that I hope one can grasp the empirical data that the archive give us and tell us more adequately. What do these numbers mean in terms of a real social, what Marx called a social form of relations? And so I wanted to address what I saw as this as a real gap in the literature on capitalism and slavery since Eric Williams, which is not a historiographic gap. There is fascinating and rich historiographic work, both for and arguing for and against Williams' theses, but more of a stepping back to take a preliminary stance and to develop some of the categories and concepts that might make those and future historical arguments about capitalism and slavery make more sense as a social phenomenon, as a phenomenon of social relationships, and not just a numbers game of how much profit, how much in terms of wealth and goods, etc. And so I wanted to make the book in that way a convincing theoretical intervention. And so this sort of Facebook origin really set the tone for me of how I was going to write it, which is I wanted to try to change people's minds. I think in the past, a lot of my work has been pursuing questions of interest to me, and I hoped it would be, of interest to others. Here, I wanted to intervene in a long-standing debate at a different, as I say, theoretical level, and try to change people's minds about the way we think of capitalist slavery.
Yeah, I know I've said this to you before, but I just cannot tell you how much I love that, in the Facebook argument, that your response was I don't know how many words it is, 85, 90,000 word book. It's you're a real role model to those of us who just lose sleep over those and argue in the shower or whatever we do. We should all turn those arguments into such great books. I wanted to follow up to what you just said, and in some ways you've spoken to this, but I wanted to ask it in a sort of direct way. Just if you could talk a little bit about this phrase social form, which comes from Marx and the Marxist tradition, of course, and it's just is such an enormously powerful phrase and powerful frame for understanding what you understand in the book, which is this phrase, capitalist slavery, the capitalism as practiced in the Caribbean iteration of slavery. So what is it about this notion of social form as a frame of analysis for you that you think helps us see something specific? Like, what is that specific? And why is this what we need to understand the racialized form of slavery that we have historically in the Caribbean?
Yeah, that's a great question, John. It makes me think there was a moment I went back after I had this little debate online, and this was all in the middle of this, we'll call it post-truth era we're going through, and social media determining what everyone's worldviews are, and as I say, I wanted to make an intervention that was actually convincing and in its demonstration, and hopefully tried to be rigorous. And I And so I went back and I one of the things I did to start was then to reread, I guess, Eric Williams' Capitalism and Slavery. And there's this, I don't know if you remember, there's this phrase in there towards the end, and he's talking about the period of emancipation and abolition in the middle of the 19th century. He's focused on England. In my own work, I've been focused on France, so around 1848 and et cetera. And so Williams has this phrase where he says, well, there, through the 19th century, there was this competition between Caribbean cane sugar and beet sugar grown in and produced in industrial Europe. And he says, then eventually, around the middle of the century, there came a point when beets freed the slaves in Martinique, and he sort of throws this phrase out there, and it's a sort of pithy thing that he proposes, but there's no. It seemed to me that it took all sorts of things for granted, and that the concept of social form precisely points to, which is to say, in what sort of a social relationship is it the case that increased productivity, implicit in what he's saying, beets freed the slaves, that increased productivity in producing beet sugar more cheaply in Europe by wage labor and industrial techniques, gradually lowering the price of beet sugar relative to Caribbean cane sugar, would free the slaves. How could the price of sugar free slaves across the globe? And so the concept of social form asks a very specific question for Marx, which is to say, how is it not just that social relations in general are constructed, but specifically the category of labor and work? How is it that in a capitalist society, social form, Marx says, labor comes to take a specific form of appearance, which is to say a monetary form of appearance, Marx says, so that our general social relationships, it's not just that capitalism is defined for Marx as everything of value tends to be turned into a commodity, air, water, everything that can be is going to be sold to make a profit. Okay, we know that. So that's a preliminary definition Marx gives in the first sentence of Capital. But he says, furthermore, social relations tend to be turned into, tend to be commodified. So that's a very specific historically limited form of social relations, and that has, of course, as we know, immense power to transform the world in all sorts of ways. And Williams' phrase sort of points to this global nature of capitalist relations, and in that moment, it's a moment that of abolition and emancipation. But of course, there are many other moments when the global profit motive, et cetera, and the ways the profitability of sugar is driving other global relationships, like the capture of Africans and their transport in the Middle Passage, and the creation of something you've worked on in your work at Glisson, the plantation, and that specific focused, limited in the sense of a precise domain that Glisson has talked so much about, of social relationships. Well, if we look at it from this level that Marx addresses of a general social form, capitalism, then he invites us at different moments that he doesn't compile into a step-by-step demonstration about slavery. That was something I needed to try to take from his argument and make a more step-by-step argument to precisely sort of try to show what the place of slavery is in capitalism, which is to say, if it doesn't produce surplus value, what does it do? It allows for the production of commodities that can possibly, like cane sugar, capture a profit at market, even though the slave labor hasn't produced surplus value. But for that sort of phrase, which is meaningless in the distinction between surplus value and profit in sort of contemporary economic jargon. For that to make sense, you have to sort of go step by step with Marx's argument, which gets pretty minute and technical at times. But the outcome is that it gives us this really capacious concept of social form, of a capitalist social form, such that we can understand what slave labor is doing within that general global form, not just locally on the plantation, not just in the numerical profits of cotton or sugar, but how it all fits together into a global structure of relations and processes of commodification and the accumulation of surplus value, especially.
Okay, thanks so much for that. I'd like to turn our attention to the Haitian Revolution, which inspires my writing, and you write about it in this book as well. And when we think of the Haitian Revolution, it's such a central part of the Caribbean imagination, if not the central part, culturally and historically. And I guess my question is, in light of this book, and how you think about the Haitian Revolution and your analysis of Marx and capitalist slavery, how do you think the way we see the Haitian Revolution has changed through your analysis of Marx and capitalist slavery in terms of humanism and so on?
That's a great question, Keisha. It makes me think that in some of the work I've done in the past, I think I've tended to focus on the Haitian Revolution as what we would call an event. That is a break, a historical rupture that brings into place and creates a novel, let's say, social form, not in the sense Marx develops it, but in a more general sense of a revolutionary transformation of social relationship, such that, say, with the creation of Haiti in 1804, that's the invention of a novel social form in which human beings are absolutely and without exception disqualified for enslavement. And so that perspective, I think, looks at an event like the Haitian Revolution in its singularity, in its novelty, in the ways that it affected a real and true historical rupture at a very basic level. For example, between the previous order of structuration of social relations in the Ancien Régime in France prior to 1789 and 1793, especially with the Jacobin Revolution. Prior to that, I would say a hierarchical structuration in which it was legitimate that Louis XVI, the king, was at the top, and everyone else in different places took their place in that hierarchical top-down order. And that was the legitimate structuration of Ancien Régime society as it understood itself, as its juridical forms and political forms enforced and stipulated. And not just the French Revolution, which of course, as we know, brought forward the 1789 Universal Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen as a basic universal prescription of egalitarianism. And at the very same time, because of the money involved, sugar was big, big money, as C.L.R. James and so many others have pointed out, the revolution needed the money to keep flowing in. And so they maintained slavery. They maintained plantation slavery, despite its obvious, evident contradiction with the declaration, the 1789 declaration, and even the more radical revolution of the Jacobins. They kept slavery in place too. And it wasn't until there was a forcing of the situation after 1791, August 1791, and then especially 1793, when Toussaint Louverture steps forward. It's only under that pressure that the Jacobins abolish slavery in February 6, 1794. And then with the Haitian Revolution, there's a different structuration, a more egalitarian, at the most basic level, structure of society. And for me, that constitutes a real event. Whereas here in this book, under the influence, I think, especially of Marx's Capital and his critique of social form, and some of the very general things that he had to say that were critical of the age of enlightenment and revolution as an opening onto capitalism, led me to think about the ways that the Haitian Revolution was not only an event in this sense I just described, but it was also a transition, as Carolyn Fick, for example, has called it. But I wondered, in this perspective that Marx opens up, a transition from what to what? And the obvious answer is from a social form of slave-based relations of production to a more capitalist, wage-based one, which Marx analyzes as the only site wage labor for the production of surplus value in capitalism. But we know that nonetheless, slavery is a part of 19th century capitalism and its consolidation and its growth and its accumulation. And so we need to be able to think that continuity and that tense and conflicted relationship of these two within a single social form. And that's something that I think hadn't been adequately addressed. It's not the focus for Marx. He's looking strictly at capitalism itself. He doesn't really ask systematically what's the place of slavery within there. And so I wanted to ask that question as a question of transition. And so there's a chapter midway through the book where I try to look at the transitional, what Carolyn Fick has called the transitional forms of labor in Saint-Domingue in Haiti from 1791 till Henri Christophe's Code Henri in 1814, where there's this strange mix of different, of both remuneration for labor paid either in kind, sugar or whatever crop, or after that crop's been transformed into a monetary form, paid monetarily, but at the same time with this stipulation that workers have to return to their plantations. There's a violent forcing and reconscription into plantation labor that they were resisting, again, as Carolyn Fick has showed in other places, Making of Haiti in particular. And so I wanted to look at theoretically, how do we think about those transitional forms of labor in the movement toward capitalism and its substantial, what Marx calls its substantial basis for the creation of surplus value wage labor, which this is sort of neither nor, it's kind of in between, and what is it doing? And so I tried to look at it, at this phenomenon theoretically to get a better picture of it, because as Marx says somewhere, the adequate subject of capitalism is precisely the subject of universal free rights. That is, a human being can only offer up their capacity to labor as a commodity if they own their own person. And Marx says in chapter 6 of Capital, otherwise they are by definition a slave, he says literally. And so it's only on that basis of the general transmission of universal human rights to create free subjects such that every human being owns their own person and thus is able to offer that labor, what Marx calls their labor power, up for sale as a commodity. And so this gives a more, let's say it's the other side of the coin. It's the dimension of the Haitian, it's one dimension of the Haitian Revolution that leads into this ambiguous situation of creating subjects of universal human rights freed from slavery as a general universal prescription and step forward, at the same time being a step into the world of industrial capitalism at a site of the peripheral production of commodities in the Caribbean in the 19th century.
Let me pick up on that. By the way, I meant to mention this at the beginning. I see there's a question in the Q&A. So if people have questions, please put them in there, and we'll, I think we'll have some time at the end, but also Valerie Orlando asked a question that's, if it's okay, I'm gonna blend into a question in just a little bit, because I think it's touches on a similar issue. But so anybody who has a question, please do put it in the Q&A. But I wanted to follow up on that and ask you about how to see Marx, but also how to see C.L.R. James and Eric Williams in light of your work. I mean, it seems to me there's almost like a dialectic that the book that operates in the background of the book, right? You have Marx, this account of capitalism and value and social form, and the way, you know, the sort of first, you know, time through capital, right? If anyone actually gets through all of capital, through the parts that everybody quotes in Capital, I should say. There's this link sort of via Hegel of, you know, this category of the slave in relation to wage, right? And then capitalist ownership of the means of production and so on. And then there is, I don't really want to say it's an antithesis, it's a kind of a quasi-dialectic, but then there's C.L.R. James and Eric Williams taking the Caribbean experience of enslavement and capitalism on Caribbean terms, right? And in that way, generating their own sort of portrait, but at the same time having, of course, a deep relationship with Marx and the Marxist tradition. And then there's your book, which goes back to Marx in a very different way than James and Williams did in order to develop something new, right? And you know, that's the newness of the book, and part of why I think it's so important. And so I'm just wondering, you know, how, in light of your book, do you think we should see Marx differently, but also how should we see James and Williams differently? Just to pick the two sort of big names from the book, and also if one thinks about Marxists in the Caribbean tradition, those would be the first two names. But how do Marx, James, Williams, how do they look differently in light of your book?
Yeah, that's a great question, John. It makes me think, I like your image of the dialectic. I think those three moments, maybe there's something to it, because it strikes me in what you're saying that there's this first moment, which is maybe as you're suggesting, I think maybe the famous site, of course, is Hegel's master-slave dialectic. And there's a sense that what Hegel puts forward there, I mean, people have argued about whether he's actually talking about slaves and plantation slavery. And then there's Susan Buckmorse's famous argument that in fact he was talking not just about modern slavery, but the Haitian Revolution. And I agree with that. But there's a sense in which that argument in the phenomenology is, of course, a very abstract one. It's a philosophical one, and that, like Susan Buckmorse's argument, for example, is definitely filling in the blanks where, as always, or usually with Hegel, he doesn't refer to the cases and examples of Diderot or whoever he's referring to, filling in the blanks. It's a very abstract argument, but there's a sense also that it's not just abstract, but I think it's also, in its abstraction, it's transhistorical. It puts forward a general sort of anthropological proposition for a relationship, a human relationship of intersubjective struggle, right? That a lot of people have written about, Axel Honneth, et cetera, et cetera. And so in its abstraction, it was taken up, of course, through the 20th century as a very productive model in all sorts of ways. I mean, Lacan and humanist Marxism and C.L.R. James and Aimé Césaire, and you know, it went all over and was very productive in its abstraction, I think. And then you have this second moment that you're pointing to of people like C.L.R. James, the Black Jacobins, and Eric Williams, which is for me more a moment of singularity in which they're looking, as you're saying, at a specific singular case and situation in a very rich and productive and novel way. And so the Black Jacobins forces us to think. First, it forces us simply to think about the Haitian Revolution a little more adequately. And it also forces us to think about it in its singularity. So certainly not as sometimes it gets caricatured as sort of it was dependent on and caused by the French Revolution and literally the Jacobins, they're just Black Jacobins. No, James is really thinking through the singularity of this event, the event of the Haitian Revolution. And then, so I've been, of course, really influenced by both of those, all of those moments of that abstraction, for example, in Hegel and in the traditional Marxist readings of it and its reception in 20th century anti-colonialism and theory, also these specific predominantly historicist arguments of James, for example, and Williams. And so I've tried, it reminds me of that phrase that I like that Aimé Césaire used to say toward the end of his life. He would tell this story about how he first read Hegel's Phenomenology in around 41 when Hippolyte first came out with his translation in French. And he said, it just blew me away. And I ran to Senghor and I said, écoute, Leopold, listen to what Hegel says, that in order to reach the universal, you have to pass through the singular. And I love that. And it was so meaningful to him, and it has so many resonances with Césaire's work. But I think here, from just drawing on what you're saying, I think that hopefully there's some kind of a movement here in which the argument that I'm proposing in the book for this theoretical framing of a general concept, capitalist slavery, is also informed. And I think that's what some of the chapters in the second half of the book are trying to do, are also informed by that singularity. So they go back to something like, to the Black Jacobins, for example, and they try to look at it in this other way, in a more, going on what James says in the preface, that he's not just involved with the art of telling this history and the compelling and beautiful narrative that he structures in that book, but also the science, what he calls the science of history. And for me, that word science suggests this really basic conceptual level where what he wants to know, this is how I'm arguing anyway in this reading, he wants to determine what are the absolutely necessary and essential elements and aspects for a successful anti-colonial revolution. And I think he identifies three, right? The movement of the masses, the idea of universal equality, and he says a great leader. Especially, he underlines that in the first edition, 38, where he's still so strongly resonating, channeling and reworking and rethinking the Bolshevik Revolution at the same time as the Haitian Revolution. And so I try to argue that he's trying to make a scientific, not just structuring a beautiful narrative out of the archival work he's done, a beautiful, compelling narrative, but also a scientific one, what he calls scientific, an adequate analysis of the necessary categories for a successful anti-colonial revolution. And so I've tried to rethink and come at these kinds of questions in a bit of a different way. And I think that I've been pushed by this approach that Marx has in Capital, because he's not unlike what some people traditionally in traditional Marxism, let's say, said. Capital isn't a history of capitalism. Marx says it explicitly. It's not about England. It's just an example that he pulls up. It's about the structural categories for capitalism anywhere, in any context if capitalism is defined as he does. And so that then holds insofar as he's correct, and insofar as this unfinished work that we call capital is correct, then it should necessarily hold for capitalist slavery. So that's what I was trying to show.
So real quick in the chat, Valerie Orlando asks if you're contextualizing this notion of singularity through Peter Howard's framework.
I've been super influenced from the beginning by Peter's work, and he's really, I mean, you know, he's one of the great thinkers in our field in so many domains. I mean, I'm, of course, his first book and his book on Haiti and Damming the Flood are hugely important for me, but also his theoretical work on Badiou and French theory in the mid 60s and the Cahiers pour l'analyse is super important for me. And so, you know, absolutely, the way that he thinks of singularity for me has been really crucial. But I'd add that in the immediate writing up and thinking about this problem here, I didn't go back and look again at the way he thinks about singularity. The way that I've been really influenced lately is not just by Marx, but by Spinoza. And Spinoza has incredibly interesting, compelling things to say about how we understand a singular, which is to say an existing phenomenon, something that actually exists in the world. And Spinoza's basic proposition is that we have to think about things in the right way, which is to say, not from their phenomenal appearance and the ways that empirically we, in our sensory perception, we take them in. For example, the ways that we, the lived experience of the violence and suffering of slavery, or of the immediate ring of the cash register of the profits coming from slavery. But rather, we have to arrive at those sorts of phenomenon starting from the essential nature of whatever phenomenon it is. And so then that position says to get to the singularity. Again, it's Césaire's reading of Hegel. To get to the singularity, we have to begin with the essential nature of whatever it is we're trying to understand. And so that's where this concept of social form is so key, because Marx starts from a very basic definition of capitalism as the commodification of everything, including social relations. That's the social form. What are the implications for the ways that our lived experience is constructed and appears to us? And so we only arrive after the fact at those forms of appearance, profits, suffering, class struggle, all these kinds of things that only are understandable, Marx says. And here I think he is really following Spinoza in this way. I think he's much more influenced, really, actually, by Spinoza, and not just implicitly that they end up doing similar things, by this way of thinking in an adequate way that Spinoza puts forward in the Ethics. And so I think it has all sorts of really important and fascinating consequences for how we think about any sort of phenomenon in this reordering of our thought process and the way we analyze things.
Okay, thanks so much for that. So when we are thinking about social form and the critiques of surplus value and the likes, we are working within a neutral frame of political analysis while really trying to make sense of a racialized form of slavery practice in the New World Caribbean. But I'd like to turn our attention to another dimension of the internal world of enslavement practiced in the New World by looking at gender. So how do you think a gendered analysis and accounting for the practice and life of slavery might alter, extend, or even complicate your analysis in this book?
That's a great question. And I think that the two key words that you put in there, aside from gender, obviously, are extend and complicate. They to bring in an analysis and a critique of gendered relations, which is not a level of analysis that I get to in this book, is essential, of course. But the way I've just described of proceeding is something that I think Marx argues very compellingly. Of course, Marx doesn't really get to an analysis or critique of gender either. He argues, though, that there's a power of what he calls abstraction that gives us the means to understand phenomena. And so he says that he starts at a very high level of abstraction on the first sentences of Capital, right? He's talking, first he defines capitalism as everything gets commodified, and that's how it appears. And then he says the cell form is the commodity. And so he abstracts from all sorts of things, not just gender, age, etc., but price, owners of commodities, all these sorts of things at the initial level. He abstracts from them precisely so that he can move from that very high level of abstraction to more and more, he says, concrete levels, which is not to say that he moves from a level of a concept into sort of materialist relations in the sense of the material world, but higher levels of complication, of concretion, in the sense of concrete where everything gets mixed together, right? Still at a theoretical level. And so if we follow that mode of argumentation from the most abstract concept in terms of capitalism, Marx says it's the commodity. And then he goes through what are the different aspects of the nature of a commodity: use value, exchange value, et cetera, and he proceeds through hundreds of pages of analysis. And where does surplus value come from, and what are wages, et cetera. And it just gets more and more complex, and it snowballs. That's why this was an unfinished lifetime project. But because it's moving from very high levels of abstraction towards ever greater levels of concretion, as it expands, not to move from the level of thought to some sort of physical materiality, but just more and more concrete, it is, insofar as it's a correct analysis, moving toward a level at which we can then begin to bring in all sorts of phenomena like gender and the very real ways that gender is articulated within this social form of general commodification. And so I think one of the crucial things that then the argument that I'm putting forward asks us is simply to move in this direction and to get to the problem, for example, of the forms of racial capitalism, or the forms and the modes in which gender is articulated within the capitalist social form as a way precisely of moving forward, carrying forward, I want to say engendering the dynamic of accumulation in very specific modalities. I think that's a further step. And in this, where my head was in writing this book, I was at this very initial level of trying to construct the categories of just how do we think about capitalist slavery? And within capitalist slavery, then if we ask about gender, if we ask about age dynamics, if we ask about racial dynamics, then we bring, I think, hopefully, different questions, different ways of understanding that articulation, not, as I said, not only as a lived experience, not only as a phenomena that we can analyze in the archives, in the historical archives, but that we can understand in its conceptual complexity what's the role of gender. And so I'm not giving you a concrete answer, because the book doesn't do that, and it but I think hopefully what it does, and is to set, and that's another aspect of the cover that I think, if I can just show it just for a second, because it is a gendered cover, right? And I did that very explicitly. I don't know if you can see it here, but I wanted to address not specifically the gender dynamics in this book, but the monetary dynamics in ways that slavery works. And so this image from this bill from the French Caribbean from the 60s conceptualizes for me in a very visually, I think, compelling way, the relationship between the living subject, in this case, a gendered, racialized subject of slavery and capitalism, the woman in the painting, with the commodity itself, the fruit that she's holding up in exchange, but also with that third aspect, which is the aspect that, as in traditional Marxism, and I think in traditional readings of Williams and capitalism and slavery in general, has been neglected, and that's what I wanted to really contribute, is that monetary aspect, what's been called recently Marx's monetary labor theory of value, which argues in the first chapters of Capital that the price, that 5,000, that contre-valeur de 50 nouveaux francs, is not just something that makes it convenient to exchange commodities. It's absolutely necessary, Marx says. And that necessity is, I think, the key to understanding why slave labor can't create surplus value, because the labor doesn't have a price in capitalist slavery, in that social form, right? Slaves, human beings, were purchased, their entire person at market, not their labor, because if there was a price for their labor, it would be something they owned. As I said before, as Marx says, it would be a commodity, but they wouldn't be slaves anymore. They would own their own person and their capacity to work. And so the focus on price that has been neglected in traditional readings of Marx's Capital and thinking about capitalism and slavery in general, I love this image because I think it conceptualizes it and conveys it in a really rich way. But hopefully the categories that I'm talking about here set a different framework for asking questions about gender, about the lived experience of racism and race, and the social construction of race. And so I think this is the framework that I'm hoping will lead to hopefully readers. It'll suggest new and different ways of thinking about these compelling questions. And so hopefully what I'm doing is setting a different tone, putting forward a different framework that will open on to these kinds of questions if people find this way of thinking about it compelling. And I think it is, right? It's not, sorry to go on, but I think it's never been a convincing argument for me that Kant or Hegel or Marx said racist things, for example, in their real ignorance about more, let's say, Kant and Hegel are obvious figures that people have pointed to often. You know, we were talking about the way Césaire read Hegel in a way Fanon, other people were familiar with. They didn't say, I'm not going to look at this guy because he's racist and he's misogynist and this and that. He had interesting conceptual things to say. He was totally ignorant about my own concerns, but his theory allows me to do other things. And so if I've been able to construct a few concepts in a way that people can take up and take in different directions that are compelling to them, then I'll be happy.
Well, thank you for that. That's that last little bit we could talk on and on and on about. This is really fantastic. But I want to shift the tone a little bit to the question of literature and poetics. In the Q&A chat, Valerie Orlando asks about how your book, the theoretical model that your book generates, impacts how we read Caribbean literature. And I had a similar question, and to just sort of add my own frame to that, which is, the book, the Price of Slavery book is, as you've talked about, it's a book about political theory, about political economy, but your previous works have engaged with Francophone Caribbean literature in really deep and extensive ways. And so I'm interested both in how you think that this book is in relation to those books, but specifically in these terms. I'm thinking about how important this notion of plantation is, and I would put it with a capital P as a critical concept that people like Antonio Benitez Rojo and Edouard Glissant, and to a certain extent also Camille Brathwaite, have really theorized in such deep ways. And what, I like the way that Glissant talks about plantation in relation to poetics, in Poetics of Relation, where he says it's a closed place, open word, right? It's this sense of absolute hegemony at a certain level, but it's leaky, right? And it produces the cultural terrain of what is now Caribbeanness, Caribbean literature in all of its varieties. And so that my own work is really so deeply embedded in that notion of plantation. And so there was something a little unnerving, I'll just say, about reading your book, in the sense of, the way your theoretical framing thinks about plantation, I think really complicates that slash that Glissant has between the closed place and the open word. And I think about, Valerie Orlando's question about how do we read Caribbean literature, that so much of Caribbean literature is about that sort of recovery of a relationship to landscape and place and to memory and memorial history. And I know your previous work had engaged this stuff quite deeply. So I'm wondering how you think contemporary critical theory in the Black Atlantic, reading literature, poetics, all this that revolves around plantation is changed by your book.
Yeah, well, first, let me say I've been changed by your work on Glissant and the plantation, and my own understanding has been so enriched, and the way you frame the question makes me think about the different levels of articulation of how this gets structured, and it makes me want to go back, for example, to reread Glissant's novels. The 4th century, and these different works, Case du Commandeur, about the plantation. And now I think about it in relation to another great book that I discovered while I was doing this, that I didn't know before, which is Dale Talmage's incredibly rich book, Slavery in the Circuit of Sugar. And he understands slavery in Martinique in the 18th and 19th century in terms of circles or spheres, where he moves from an analysis of how the sugar plantation itself works in its dynamics, to its place in the Black Atlantic, to its place in global capitalism, et cetera. But your comment makes me want to look at the question in a different way. Maybe you can call it a topological way, and sort of, the way Freud thought about our consciousness, our subjectivity, in a topological way, with consciousness and superego, right? And he made these different levels, but they're neither rings nor they're hierarchical, right? They're in a complex relationship where we perceive that relationship through the different effects, right? In dream work, for example. And if we think about the plantation in this topological way, certainly it's not just focused on the plantation itself and its microdynamics, nor is it just sort of the big global step back picture of the world system and all. But if I think somebody like Glissant or even Césaire, who are engaging with, as you say, poetics, and so I mentioned dream work. I think the poetics, the poetic aspect of it invites us to look at these different levels as they interact and transform each other in really consequential and fascinating ways. And for example, the way that the category of the real works in Césaire's poetics, in his politics as well, in which he's in his poetics where he's trying to engage the level of human subjective experience in the symbolic domain, right? As Lacan would say, the symbolic, right? Poetry, but at its very edge, right? At the very edge of symbolic experience as it touches on the real. And that's something that Césaire thinks about very concretely in his essays in the 40s and 50s. In a way that I find really fascinating. And so if we think about this in terms of topology, we can try to think about it as rigorously as possible. So I've been, this book engages with a lot of theory and concepts and tries to move in this way I described, from the abstract to the concrete, but at a very theoretical level along the way. But then when we bring in a different topological level, like as you're suggesting, like Glissant and the plantation, or Césaire and the experience of the real as a racial dynamic, right? The mot nègre, and the way that he poeticizes this in the most violent way and gets us to think about the raw violence of racism and its dynamic at the very edge of human symbolic experience. He needs poetry, he needs poetics to do that, but in a way that inflects and hopefully transforms not just subjective experience. Certainly reading Césaire's poetry or Glissant's writing it transforms our subjective understanding of the world, but hopefully it also impacts at this very basic structural level, this theoretical level in which we engage with the forms that structure and determine our human experience as a poetics, but also as a theoretical understanding of something like capitalist slavery, so that then we can understand its gender dynamics, its racial dynamics, its historical dynamics, and all of these different phenomenologies, so that they're meaningful, because they have meaningful conceptual categories that give meaning to the archive, that give meaning to the raw violence of lived experience, and help us to understand it and to transform it.
Keisha, do you want to take us out?
Okay. As we close, we'd just like to thank Dr. Nick Nesbitt for this wonderful talk. It was really enjoyable for me. As I told you previously, it took me back to my childhood and reading Eric Williams' Capitalism and Slavery. So I really enjoyed the text and the discussion, such an enriching discussion. So thank you. Thanks everyone for being here today. And of course, Dr. Drabinski, it was a pleasure working with you on this. And I learned so much from our discussions as well. And thanks, of course, to Dr. Chico and Dr. Nelson for all your work in putting this together. Thank you all for being here. And I hope this was an enriching discussion for you and you learned a bit more about capitalism and social forms. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.